There was once a plan to build the ideal city in the heart of the Netherlands. However, planners and architects had radically different ideas. Many saw a new city with simple shapes and a new identity, while others saw intricate designs and a connection to the nation's past. It was a clash between functionalism and traditionalism, with modernist ideals ultimately shaping the creation of the Netherlands' newest province. This is Flevoland. Established in 1996 as part of the Zuiderzee Works, it was the largest land reclamation project in Dutch history. For over 60 years, the Dutch constructed an intricate system of dams and dikes and created new land. Along with Delta Works, it has earned recognition as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. While the functionalist ideals behind these new cities aim to create the perfect city for the 20th century, the urban areas face criticism for being repetitive and soulless. But why did this happen? What went wrong after decades of careful planning to reclaim land and build the ideal city? The Dutch have a centuries-long history of battling water to protect their land, as several devastating floods throughout the centuries have claimed thousands of lives and destroyed thousands of homes. Approximately 1/4 of the Netherlands lies below sea level today, and without continuous human intervention, it would be underwater. The Dutch had made plans to cut off the Zuiderzee from the North Sea to protect the region from storms and floods. However, it was the devastating storm surge of 1916 that provided the decisive push. This event led to the initiation of the Zuiderzee Works in the 1920s. The project involved constructing several dams, dikes, and new land known as polders. Before large-scale efforts began, a test polder was created. Once this initial project proved successful, construction moved forward at full scale. One of the most iconic achievements of the Zuiderzee Works was the completion of the Afsluitdijk in 1933. This 32-kilometer-long dam cut off the saltwater Zuiderzee from the Waddenzee and provided a barrier from the open sea. As a result, the former saltwater inlet was transformed into a freshwater lake, and the Almere was born. This transformation not only improved flood protection, but also created a large body of freshwater for farming and drinking. To create new land known as polders, portions of the Almere were enclosed with barriers known as dikes. Once they were completed, large pumping stations drained the enclosed areas. After they were drained, the result was surreal. Humans had created land that had been buried underwater for thousands of years. However, the newly reclaimed land was still full of water. To prepare it for use, planes scattered reed seeds over the surface, which would grow and extract water from the soil. New life started to appear on the land, and once the reeds had fulfilled their purpose, they were burned to clear the land. Machines dug draining ditches to remove excess water, and the land was soon ready for cultivation and urban development. This incredible effort transformed the former Zuiderzee and resulted in the creation of 4 main polders: Rijngermeer polder, Noordoost polder, Eastern and Southern Flevoland polders. Together, they added approximately 1,600 square kilometers of new land, with the last 3 forming the province of Flevoland. This remarkable human achievement stands out clearly from the rest of the country when looked at from space. Initially, the polders were planned primarily for agricultural purposes. However, it was later decided that housing was also necessary. During the planning stage of the polders, different ideas were presented on how to proceed with urban development. On the one hand, there were people advocating for traditionalism or classical architecture with ornamentation. On the other hand, architects supported functionalism or modernist architecture without ornamentation. Functionalism emerged in the early 20th century, guided by the famous principle, form follows function. This concept was first introduced by the American architect Louis Sullivan in Chicago in the late 19th century. While Sullivan emphasized function, he still included some ornamentation in his designs, and his buildings still followed classical proportions. His ideas spread worldwide. In 1910, the Austrian architect Adolf Loos gave a lecture in Vienna called Ornament and Crime, where he argued that lack of ornament is a sign of spiritual strength, and that cultural evolution is equivalent to the removal of ornament from articles in daily use. His idea focused on the functionality of buildings rather than their aesthetic appeal. This was a radical shift from the ornamented styles that make up about 3,000 years of Western architecture. His ideas heavily influenced the Bauhaus school of architecture in Germany, which became one of the most significant movements in functionalist design, shaping what we now know as modernist architecture. With the use of new materials like reinforced concrete and steel, and methods like prefabricated construction, functionalism spread across the world. In the Netherlands, the style movement, known for advocating abstract forms, became popular, and the Schroeder House in Utrecht is one of the most famous examples. It embodied the principles of functionalism with flat roofs and simple geometric shapes. This approach rejected traditional design principles such as symmetry, which is often found in classical architecture. However, some Dutch architects like Grandpère Molière strongly criticized functionalism. Molière was a professor at TU Delft and was inspired by rural Dutch architecture. The group of architects around Molière became known as the Delft School of Architecture, or traditionalists. Traditionalists emphasize preserving classical design principles, favoring slope roofs over flat ones, incorporating some ornamentation, advocating natural building materials like brick and stone, and adhering to classical proportions, often with symmetrical designs. Although they did use steel and concrete, these materials were used to make up the structure of a building, but covered the exterior with brick and stone to maintain a classical facade. One of the most famous examples is the Enschede City Hall. It was built according to traditionalist design principles. These two distinct ideologies, functionalism and traditionalism, were choices urban planners and architects had to consider when designing new areas. After World War I, functionalism grew in popularity as countries needed to rebuild housing quickly. However, in the 1930s, traditionalism still influenced the first polders development, focusing on classical designs. Several buildings were made of brick and followed classical design principles, though only a few small villages were built. Similarly, in Noordoostpolder, completed 12 years later, traditionalist principles were also used. However, this approach didn't last long. After the devastating bombardment of Rotterdam and other parts of the country that suffered destruction during World War II, new homes were again needed quickly and cheaply. During this period, the focus shifted heavily toward functionality, providing basic shelter rather than focusing on the design details of the buildings. The ideals of functionalism fit perfectly. Buildings can be made quickly and cheaply using prefabricated slabs. It was a new beginning for the world and a new beginning for the Netherlands. In the 1940s, an architect named Cornelis van Eerste became involved in the development of the polders. He was the chairman of SIAM, the International Congresses of Modern Architecture. SIAM embraced functionalist principles. Modernists preferred minimalist designs with flat roofs, simple shapes, and no ornamentation. Form follows function. It's more about focusing on what a building does rather than how it looks. As planning continued, modernist ideals began to shape future cities. In 1958, Van Eerste was commissioned by the Dutch government to design a detailed urban plan for Lelystad, which would become the administrative center of Flevoland. The other city to be built would be Almere, located near Amsterdam. Over the years, various designs were proposed with changes in the urban form, but the core planning concept remained. Many new homes were designed with flat roofs and simple geometric shapes, marking the identity of the new Netherlands. Modernists also advocating separating functions, meaning residential areas would be separated from commercial zones. The exception was the city center, where there was a mix of shops and apartments. However, the rest of Lelystad and Almere was essentially one large Dutch suburb with residential buildings. Modernist developments sprang up across the country and throughout Europe. While many of these developments were relatively high density, in Flevoland they were mostly designed with low densities. Key criticisms of Flevoland's development include the repetitiveness of its neighborhoods, a lack of social cohesion, and its low-density layout. Walking the streets today, these criticisms still hold true. There is not much going on, and it really is a stark contrast to other Dutch cities like Amsterdam. Several modernist neighborhoods across Europe, especially the ones with large buildings, became unpopular and faced issues over time, and there was only one thing left to do. Throughout the Netherlands, architecture from the same period as Flevoland's development is often being demolished and replaced with new modernist developments, and not just tall buildings. While new developments may look different from those constructed in Flevoland, modern developments still follow the same design philosophy of simple shapes and new forms. However, a key difference is that these new modernist neighborhoods often feature a mix of functions. For example, in denser developments, buildings typically have shops on the ground floor with apartments above, but the underlying design principles remain the same. Criticism of buildings that depart from classical proportions has existed since the 1920s, with English philosopher Roger Scruton emerging as an important voice in more recent years. Since the 1980s, Scruton has advocated for preserving traditional design principles, emphasizing that architecture that doesn't respect the past is not respecting the present, because it is not respecting people's primary need from architecture to build a long-lasting home. He argues that new modernist developments could eventually face the same fate as the older modernist designs today. They will get demolished in a few decades, and newer modernist designs will be built, which isn't sustainable. New classical designs, however, are more likely to stand the test of time, as they draw from thousands of years of tradition and are valued for their timeless appeal, which won't go out of fashion. Scruton highlights the importance of seamlessly blending into the local context, as these new buildings do in Amsterdam, a view shared by traditionalists a century ago. Scruton describes modernist architecture as soulless and sterile, and says that when the public began to react to the brutal concrete style of the 1960s, architects simply replaced it with a new kind of junk. Glass walls, hung on steel frames, with absurd details that don't match. The result is another kind of failure to fit, and is there simply to be demolished. He praises projects like Poundbury in the UK, designed by architect Leon Creer. Poundbury embraces classical design principles and isn't significantly more expensive to build than modernist neighborhoods. In the Netherlands, similar developments such as Brandevoort and Westbursluis reflect traditionalist ideals. There are several places worldwide where alternatives to modernist urban developments have been implemented. Even in Flevoland, some newer projects show traditionalist influences, but most new developments in the Netherlands continue to follow modernist principles. Around the world, advocates for new classical architecture, including organizations like Inbouw Netherlands, promote new classical designs. Modernist architects, however, often refer to new classical developments like Poundbury as pastiche or soulless, suggesting that these designs simply mimic past styles without offering anything innovative or original. They believe that each new situation requires a new architecture, meaning that each period or context should have a forward-thinking design. They also emphasize sustainability by focusing on using more sustainable materials and innovative construction methods, and integrating greenery into urban spaces, often placing less emphasis on the building's long-term aesthetic appeal. The design of most new buildings breaks from historical proportions and embraces new forms. The Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas captures the essence of modern architecture with this line. Together, all these breaks with scale, with architectural composition, with tradition, with transparency, with ethics, imply the final, most radical break. Bigness is no longer part of any urban tissue. It exists. At most, it coexists. Its subtext is context. Houses and modernist buildings stand apart, focusing on their own design rather than blending into their surroundings, unlike traditionalist designs, which emphasize a stronger connection to the local context and a human scale. Houses with classical designs, such as the Art Deco buildings in New York, also break the human scale, but maintain a stronger connection to their context compared to modern glass buildings. New traditionalist designs, like modernist ones, also focus on sustainable building materials and integrating greenery. However, advocates for new classical architecture often argue that no matter how eco-friendly the materials or how green the space is, if a building is built upon modernist principles, it will go out of fashion and it will be demolished. We'll never know what a traditionalist Lelystad or Almere might have looked like, but the closest example can be found in Amsterdam Zuid. This neighborhood embodies many principles of traditionalist urbanism and architecture, while also showcasing the distinct style of the Amsterdam school. The traditionalist buildings feature sloped roofs and classical proportions, and are constructed using brick and stone. The design of new buildings goes beyond different opinions. The design of buildings impacts how we feel and think. One study in Norway suggests that modern architectural styles, characterized by asymmetry and a lack of ornamentation, are evaluated less positively than traditional styles, which are symmetrical and ornamented. Additional research supports the idea that people generally prefer traditionalist designs, though it is emphasized that more studies are needed. Today, the debate continues. Many say each new situation requires a new architecture, while others argue beauty is vanishing from our world because we live as though it did not matter. The future of our cities and neighborhoods reflects the debates of the past century. The real question is, which approach will shape the cities of tomorrow?